Hi kids! Our lesson today is called Food Chain Frenzy. Last time we learned about how weather is important to our plants. But just like the garden, animals need water and sun to survive. In our lesson today, we'll discuss how food chains, food webs, and the energy from the sun gets passed around and shared by plants, animals, and people. As I go through our vocab today, make sure to write down notes in your garden journal. You can also draw little pictures to match our vocab words. Our first word of the day is food chain. And the food chain is the order in which living things in an ecosystem depend on each other for food. So in a little food chain like this one with the fish, you can see that the little fish gets eaten by the medium fish, and the medium fish gets eaten by the big fish in their food chain. Our second word, food web, is similar to a food chain, but these are food chains that overlap within an ecosystem. For example, a bobcat can eat a rat on land, or he can eat a fish from the river. So he eats from two different ecosystems, and that makes it combine into a food web. An herbivore is an animal or insect that eats plants only. They don't eat any meat or any other animals. An example of some herbivores are pandas, horses, and caterpillars. A carnivore is an animal that eats only meat from other animals. They don't eat any plants. Some examples of carnivores are sharks and lions. If herbivores eat only plants and carnivores eat only meat, then what are humans? We are something special, which is a bonus word called an omnivore, and that means you can eat plants or animals. Have you ever wondered what makes so many plants green? It's actually called chlorophyll. It's inside the plants, and it makes plants green, which is what allows it to absorb energy from the sunlight. Plants are able to make sugar from sunlight during photosynthesis. Our last vocab term is organic matter. You might already know this one from other lessons, but it basically means anything that was once living that is breaking down. Let's go back to one of our first vocab words and talk a little bit more about what a food chain is. We'll think about who the members of a food chain are and where they occur. Well, food chains are made up of all different organisms. Every organism is part of its own food chain. And food chains can be found in the ocean, on the land, in the air, everywhere around the world there are food chains. Food chains are made up of producers, consumers, and many decomposers. Let's start with the producers. The producers are the plants that can create their own food energy. They use the sun's energy, and through photosynthesis, they transform it into sugars. And those sugars now can be eaten by the consumers. The consumers at the bottom of the food chain are plant-eating animals, like deer and mice. Then there's consumers above them who are meat-eating animals, like hawks and mountain lions. Finally, there's the decomposers, like bacteria, fungi, and insects that can break down dead plants and dead animals from the food system into organic matter. There are a lot of relationships between all of the producers, consumers, and decomposers of an ecosystem, and that creates the entire food chain. Now it's going to get a little trickier. We're going to look at a food web. A food web is different from a food chain because it describes the balance between plants, animals, and people in multiple ecosystems at once. Let's think about how everything in a food web depends on each other. For example, what would happen if there were no plants? Well, there would be a lot of hungry animals. Herbivores would have nothing to eat and they would starve, and so would the carnivores because they eat the herbivores. Now, what if there were plants but no carnivores? Well, there would still be hungry herbivores because there would be too many of them and not enough plants to keep up with everything that they're eating. So we know how everything is connected, but I want to remind you where all the energy in the food chain comes from. It all comes from the sun. It starts with the sun. The plants can convert the sunlight into sugar. Herbivores can eat the plants. Then carnivores can eat the herbivores. And eventually, when the animals and plants die, they're eaten by decomposers and they're broken down into organic matter. Wow, everyone, we just learned a lot about our ecosystems and food chains. I think it's time for you to go outside with your garden educator and get to see how things are going in the garden.
Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Mary out in the garden, and boy, what a lot you just learned about the food web and the food chain. Well, I thought for our activity today that it would be fun to go through our own little garden and see if we can find those members of the food chain. We will be looking for producers and consumers and decomposers. All those characters play a very important role in the food chain. So let's go take a look and see what we can find in our habitats, both great and micro. So let's start on this end of the garden and we'll just walk around and see what we can see. So here we have our Swiss chard, and wow, what's going on in front of that raised bed there? That looks like a habitat, and a pretty good sized habitat. I'm going to guess that that is the habitat of a gopher, and this is their home where they can find shelter in the ground and they can come up and nibble on our roots. So we're not too happy about that, but it is a great example. So he is a consumer of the chard, which is a producer. So let's go take a look around here. So here's another producer, that's our sage. And more producers. They're all just so happy getting all that sun and creating chlorophyll. Ooh, here's a pretty producer. Those are the snapdragons. Now this pepper is such a great example why we call this a producer. It's creating edible foods for other members of the food chain. So here is a beautiful pepper that I, as a human, would be very happy to eat. That would make me a consumer. And all those sugars that I would eat in that pepper create energy for me to survive. So let's go take a look at another habitat here. Now this is a microhabitat, and micro we know means small. So underneath this leaf, there's a whole community going on. You can see that there's ants crawling around there, and they are actually acting as farmers. They are harvesting honeydew that comes from these aphids, and as a gardener, it's kind of aggravating because they're going to spread those aphids everywhere and they're just not good for the plants. But it does make for a very good example of a microhabitat. So let's see what else we have. That's our crop of beans there. And oh, I see a habitat. I see a habitat of a decomposer. Now, I don't know if we'll see any, but all in this straw, this is what we use for mulch, all in this straw are all kinds of different insects, predominantly earwigs. They love it in here. So they are the decomposers, and they help to break down all this dead material so that it goes back into the soil to feed the soil and help the plants out. Now, there's one more thing that I saw over here when I came in. I am not going to show it to you because it's not pretty, but there is a dead gopher in the garden who was clearly attacked by something. And that gopher, we don't know if he lived here or not, but that is a perfect example of the food chain. He is a smaller mammal. He is a consumer of our producers here, just a herbivore, leaf-eating herbivore. But he has been attacked and consumed by a larger carnivore. And I'm assuming it is the garden kitty. Anyway, on a happier note, our garden is looking really quite beautiful, and it's all full of consumers and producers. And as we just saw, there's herbivores and carnivores. So that's our conclusion of our little garden tour. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.
Make sure that you can answer all these questions in your garden journal.